Portrait of ARON NIMZOVICH by Raymond Keene. This tape is linked to my book, ARON NIMZOVICH, A Reappraisal, which is published by G. Bell & Sons. Amongst those outstanding personalities of chess history, who have narrowly failed in their ambition to become world champion, Nimzovich was perhaps the most colourful, making his impressive mark not only with his successful play, but also with his profound writings, and his eccentric behaviour both on and off the chessboard. For example, in one international tournament in which he participated, he became involved in an argument with the German player John, and threatened to throw him out of the window of the tournament hall. His aversion to tobacco smoke became famous. Nimzovich was born in Riga on November the 7th, 1886, of the Jewish family Niemcovich, which was spelt Niemzowitsch. Nimzovich learnt the moves of chess at an early age from his father, who was an accomplished chess master in his own right. But it wasn't until 1904, while he was in Germany, ostensibly to study mathematics, that Nimzovich began to concentrate on chess. At first his talent lay in the tactical and purely combinational field, but several failures led him to undertake a complete revision of his chess ideas, laying more stress on positional play, restrictive strategies, and consolidation. With his changed outlook on chess, Nimzovich began to achieve significant successes, including a share of second prize, with Spielmann, but behind Rubinstein, at the great international tournament of San Sebastian in 1912, and later on he shared first prize, equal with Alexander Alyakhin, at the All-Russian Championship, St. Petersburg 1913. The Great War of 1914 to 1918, combined with the Russian Revolution, brought an abrupt halt to Nimzovich's chess activities. In 1920, or perhaps slightly earlier, he fled Latvia for Scandinavia, changing his name in the process from Niemzovich, spelt with an E, to Nimzovich, spelt Nimzowitsch. There's an amusing story told about this. Desperately anxious to escape from his war-torn homeland, he applied for an exit visa. It took weeks to come, and when it did arrive, the local officials had left the E out of his name. Rather than send the visa back, and possibly risk further delays, Nimzovich acquiesced in the loss of the E, and left for Scandinavia. And when he got there, he found he preferred his name without the E, and he never put it back in his name again. Of course, this tale may be apocryphal. After his escape, Nimzovich at first took refuge in Sweden, but eventually he decided to settle in Denmark. However, his return to tournament competition in the early 1920s was a total disaster. Gradually he played himself into form, securing a number of notable successes in the mid-1920s, including a share of first prize with Rubinstein at Marienbad in 1925, an outstanding first place at Dresden in 1926, scoring 8.5 out of 9, ahead of Alyakhin, who got 7, and Rubinstein, who got 6.5, and finally a first place at Hanover in 1926. It was during this fruitful period that Nimzovich's most influential work, Mein System, appeared. This is known in English, of course, as My System, and this underwent several revisions until 1928. This book is still a bestseller in many translations all over the chess world. Unfortunately for him, his ultimate goal, the World Championship title, still eluded him. Nimzovich took third place in the New York Candidates Tournament in 1927, behind Capablanca and Alyakhin. His brilliant first prize at Carlsbad in 1929 was achieved ahead of Capablanca, Rubinstein, Erva, and Bogolyubov. Yet Alyakhin was not competing. His performance at Carlsbad possibly justified Nimzovich in adopting the title he somewhat pompously assumed himself, the Crown Prince of the chessboard, and he even had this title printed on his visiting cards. But the reigning monarch, Alyakhin, refused to give way, and Nimzovich's best results from 1929 onwards, for example his second at San Remo in 1930, and his third prize at Bled in 1931, all of these were achieved in the shadow of the great Alyakhin. It was ill health that caused Nimzovich's sudden decline in the mid-1930s, and in spite of a succession of first prizes in lesser events, such as Copenhagen 1933, and again at Copenhagen in 1934, and the narrow match victory over the rising star Geza Stolz, also in 1934, his defeat by Stahlberg in their match, and his 7th place at the Zurich International Tournament, revealed quite clearly that Nimzovich's old force was gone. He died on March 16, 1935, a mere 48 years old. His death occurred at the Hareskov Sanatorium in Copenhagen. Some say that he died of pneumonia, others that he fell victim to cancer of the stomach. In his playing style, Nimzovich belonged to the so-called hypermodern school, which held, among other things of course, that control of the centre did not necessarily entail occupation by pawns. Adherence to these hypermodern views, combined with a decided mutual incompatibility, brought Nimzovich into frequent opposition with the great German master of the classical school, Dr. Siegbert Tarrasch. Neither of these two great masters was averse to self-adulation, and bitterness emanating from their first meeting in 1904 was never entirely eradicated. In fact, hostility toward Tarrasch and his works was a recurring theme of Nimzovich's literary endeavours. Nevertheless, Nimzovich's major contribution to chess literature consisted not in his witty ridicule of Dr. Tarrasch, nor yet so much in the discovery of a novel method of play, but it was the elaboration of a new chess vocabulary which rendered the imperfectly expressed strategy of leading players accessible to the general chess-playing public. Nimzovich possessed an unrivalled facility for capturing the essence of an already known operation or structure with a memorable or meaningful word or phrase, which thereby increased speed of comprehension and assisted clarity of thought. Nimzovich introduced into chess terminology such formulae as the passed pawn's lust to expand, the mysterious rook move, prophylaxis, the 7th rank absolute, and hanging pawns. It's an established phenomenon of human affairs that rapid advances in performance are often immediately preceded by advances in modes of expression, and we may indeed detect an upsurge in the general level of chess capability after the publication of his book My System. Nimzovich's writings were penned with such an enthusiastic and elusive wit that only the most hardened of cultural morons could resist the appeal of his message. Consider the following on the subject of the isolated pawn. It's to be found in My System. We no longer consider it necessary to render the enemy isolani absolutely immobile. On the contrary, we like to give him the illusion of freedom rather than shut him up in a cage. Here we can see the principle of the large zoological garden applied to the small beast of prey. In a second area of chess science, Nimzovich also made a decisive contribution, and it is difficult to think of anyone who exerted a comparable influence on opening theory in our time. Apart from his most famous brainchild, the Nimzovich Indian defence to the Queen's pawn, which he introduced into international practice in 1914, Nimzovich also pioneered the Venava variation of the French defence, which is in fact known on the continent as the Nimzovich variation. In addition, he carried out important investigations into Philidor's defence, 3. White pawn to e5 in the French defence, the Queen's Indian defence, and the English opening. He was also responsible for the invention of the Nimzovich variation of the Sicilian defence, which goes like this: 1. White pawn to e4, black pawn to c5, 2. White knight to f3, met by black knight to f6. And Nimzovich was also the first great master to employ 1. White pawn to b3 as white's opening move. The other main defence which bears his name is first move for white, pawn to e4, met by black knight to c6. This, the Nimzovich defence to the king's pawn, forms the subject of another cassette lecture by Tim Harding. Nimzovich's most important publications were Die Blockade, Mein System, translated as My System, Die Praxis meines Systems, translated rather feebly as Chess Praxis. In addition, he contributed frequently to Kagan's Neueste Schachnachrichten during the 1920s and 1930s. And for further information on Nimzovich, you should either consult Nielsen's book in Danish, called Nimzovich, Denmark's Skaklehrer, or my own book, ARON NIMZOVICH, A Reappraisal, published by G. Bell & Son. Now that we've learnt something about Nimzovich's life and his personality, let's examine a few fascinating positions and games that he produced during his chess career. The first position I want to look at is a game played between Nimzovich, white, and Hofer at Nuremberg in 1904. Now, I'll give you the position to set up on your chessboard, starting with the white pieces. Are you ready? Clear your chessboard, and now start putting the pieces on. White king on h2. White queen on h5. White bishops on f6 and a4. White knight on e5 and white pawns on g2, f2, e3 and d4. That's the white position. Now for the black pieces. Black king on g8, black queen on a2, black rooks on a8 and f8, black rooks on a8 and f8, black knight on h3, black knight on h3. It's a funny square, I know, but it's true, it's on h3. And now for the black pawns. Black pawn on h7, black pawn on g7, black pawn on f7, another one on e6, d3, black pawn on d3, black pawn on c4, and a black pawn on a7. Now, it's white's move in this position, and in fact he has a rather straightforward method of winning the game. He can just play queen g4, for example, forcing black to move his pawn to g6. Then he can capture the knight on h3 with his queen, and black has no defense to mating threats with the queen and the bishop. However, Nimzovich found an absolutely fantastic way of winning this position, and I suggest you switch off your tape for some time, quite a long time, and see if you can find out what it was. Switch off now and think about the position. Well, what did you find? What Nimzovich played was a typical example of a combination which no one else would even have thought of. His first move, white's first move, is bishop from a4 to e8. Bishop from a4 to e8. You may be completely puzzled by this move. What's the point of it? The point is to bring black's queen's rook to e8, where it blocks the escape route for black's king. Black's reply was rook on a8 takes white bishop on e8. Now, the time has come to think again. If you didn't guess white's first move, switch off once more and see if you can find Nimzovich's second move. Switch off now and think about the position. Did you spot it? I once showed this position to the Russian ex-world champion Mikhail Tal and said, what would you play in this position? And he said in a split second, queen h6. Nimzovich's second move was queen from h5 to h6. It looks crazy, doesn't it? Black, completely stunned, played pawn on g7, takes white queen on h6. Actually, a better move would have been to take white's bishop on f6. Anyway, he took the queen. And Nimzovich's third move, which we should be able to see quite easily, was knight from e5 to g4. Knight from e5 to g4. And as you can see quite clearly, black has absolutely no defence at all to knight on g4, coming to h6, checkmate. You see, the queen's rook was lured to e8, the king's rook can't move at all, and black's king is entirely boxed in. Although he's a queen, a rook, and several pawns up, some of which were about to queen, he's completely helpless. It's brilliant, isn't it? Once you've recovered from the brilliant shock of this variation, we'll move on to the second position. Please clear your chessboards once again, and I will set up a new position. Our second example is a game played by Nimzovich, who was white again, against a Norwegian master called Jokstad. It was played in a blindfold display. Nimzovich couldn't see the pieces, he had to play in his head, over 3 boards at Bergen in 1921. Now, I hope you've got a clear board. I'll read out the pieces for you to set up, starting with white. White king on b1. White king on b1. White queen on b3. White rooks on g4 and h5. White bishop on c4. White knight on e4. And now for the white pawns. a2, b2, f2, and f4. That's the white position. Now for the black pieces, starting with the king on g8, black king on g8, black queen on c7, black rooks on a8 and f8, black bishop on c5, black knight on a5, and black pawns h7, g6, f7, d4, b6, and b7. Now you should have the position set up. It's white's move. You should observe first of all that he's 2 pawns down. You should note in the second place that black's knight on a5 is forking white's queen and his king's bishop, and that any exchange of pieces is obviously going to be to black's advantage. But finally you have to notice that white has rather a strong attack on the king's side, and his rooks are in unusually aggressive positions. Now, switch off for some time and see if you can spot the brilliant combination with which Nimzovich finished off his opponent. Remember that he played this game without sight of the board. Well, what did you find? White's first move is a sacrifice to break open, or crack open in fact, the wall of pawns around black's king. White's first move is rook on g4, takes black pawn on g6, check. Obviously black has no choice. He must play black pawn on h7 takes white rook on g6. Now, if you didn't get white's first move, switch off again, have another think about the position, and see if you can find the follow-up to Nimzovich's combination. If you did find rook takes g6 check, carry straight on. Nimzovich's second move was another rook sacrifice, but a very quiet one this time. He slid his queen over from b3 to h3. White's second move is queen from b3 to h3. This has the threat rook from h5 to h8 check, king to g7, and then queen down to h6 or h7 checkmate. Again, black clearly has only one reply. He must play pawn on g6, takes white rook on h5. If you saw white's second move, queen to h3, carry straight on. But once again, if you didn't spot that, I'll give you another chance to switch off and see if you can find the last few moves of the combination. White's third move was not the obvious queen check on g3 or g2, but the far more subtle knight on e4 to f6 check. Black's king must come to g7, and now the death blow. Queen from h3 to g2 check. Of course there was another choice, he could have put the queen on g3, that makes no difference at all. Now if black doesn't capture the knight, for example if he plays his king to h8, then the white queen simply comes to g5, and there's no defence to the mate on h6. So, after the queen had gone to g2 check, black's king took the knight on f6, and the queen crept up to g5, checkmate. Another very beautiful example of Nimzovich's imagination when carrying out an attack. For our third position, we take a game played by Nimzovich in a simultaneous display at Copenhagen, which became his hometown, in the year 1930. Nimzovich once more was white, and his opponent was the Danish player W. Nielsen. Clear your board of pieces once again, and we'll set up the key position, starting with the white pieces. White king on g1. White king on g1. White queen on f3. White rooks on c7 and e4. White bishop on e5. And 6 white pawns, a2, b2, d4, f2, g2, and h3. That's the white position. Now for black's position, we start with the king on g8, black king on g8, black queen on d5, black rooks on a8 and f8, black rooks on a8 and f8, and black bishop on d6. And 6 black pawns, a7, a7, b6, e6, and 3 in front of the king, f7, g7, h7, f7, g7, and h7. Once again, it's white's move in this position. And before I ask you to switch off and see if you can discover the decisive combination, I'll give you a few clues. First of all, we can see that both of white's rooks are in unusually aggressive positions, and this fact should be borne in mind when working out the decisive continuation. Secondly, we see that there is definite pressure from the bishop on e5 against black's king side, especially against the square g7. However, black's bishop on d6, forking the rook on c7 and the bishop on e5, is threatening to undermine this pressure completely. So, when looking for the decisive continuation, you have to find some way of neutralizing the strength of black's bishop on d6. Well, switch off now and see what you can find. White's first move is rook from c7 to d7, rook from c7 to d7. That's a very obvious move. You pin the bishop that's threatening to break the attack. Of course, black can't capture on e5 because he would forfeit his queen. So he has to defend his bishop from behind. He can't do it with the king's rook because f7 pawn would cave in. So black's next move is completely forced. He must play rook from a8 to d8, rook from a8 to d8. If you didn't get this far in your calculations, switch off, have another think. If you did, please play straight on. White's next move is much more difficult than the first one. Nimzovich's second move, logically, but also brilliantly, removes the bishop. Rook on d7 takes black bishop on d6. Rook on d7 takes black bishop on d6. Now the bishop on e5 has no worries at all. It can proceed with the demolition of black's kingside. If you didn't find the second move, rook takes d6, switch off again. If you did, please play on. Black, of course, had to take back on d6 with his rook. Now for white's third move. This is really very difficult indeed, and I suggest you think very, very carefully before committing yourself. White's third move was queen from f3 to f6. Fantastic move. It threatens queen takes g7 mate, obviously. Black can't break the threat with queen on d5 takes bishop on e5. White simply recaptures with his queen, leaving him with a queen for a rook and an easy win on material. Black has no choice. He must play black pawn on g7 takes white queen on f6. And now the bishop on e5 finally comes into its own. White's reply was rook on e4 to g4 check. Black's king has to go into the corner, king on g8 to h8. And now the coup de grace. Bishop on e5 takes the pawn on f6. Checkmate. A brilliant and logical exploitation of the strength of the bishop on the square e5. And all that was played in a simultaneous display. On side 1 of this tape, we looked at Nimzovich's personality and his history, and we also examined a few positions from his games. On side 2, I want to look at a couple of complete games that he played, so please set up your pieces in the starting position. If they aren't ready, switch off the tape, get the pieces ready, and then we'll go over the games. Nimzovich had a strange facility for creating mysterious games. Irving Chernev wrote that his chess was witch chess, heathen and beautiful. Well, that's a bit purple prosy for me, but I can see his point. Some of his games looked more like composed studies than things created in the heat of the battle between two opposing chess masters. And Nimzovich had a really rather strange pride in his own creative performances. Now, the first game I want to take a look at is one he won against the German master Fritz Zamisch. Zamisch was white, Nimzovich was black, of course. The game was played in the Copenhagen tournament of 1923, which Nimzovich won decisively, and the opening was a Queen's Indian defence. Are you ready? White's first move. White pawn to d4. Black knight to f6. White pawn to c4. Black pawn to e6. Now, if white plays his knight to c3, black will play his bishop from f8 to b4, and this is Nimzovich's own famous defence, the Nimzovich Indian, or Nimzo Indian, or simply Nimzovich defence to the queen's pawn. The idea is that black uses his pieces to stop white from forming a broad pawn centre with pawns on e4, d4 and c4. Instead of 3 knight to c3, white's third move was knight from g1 to f3. Knight from g1 to f3. And now Nimzovich employs another one of his own ideas. It's called the Queen's Indian defence, but it's really only a variation of his own Nimzo Indian defence. His third move was black pawn to b6, black pawn to b6. And the idea of this is to develop the bishop from c8 to b7, once again controlling the e4 square, and hindering white in the formation of a pawn centre. Now Zamisch decided to oppose the fianchetto development of black's queen's bishop. His fourth move was white pawn to g3. White's fourth move white pawn to g3. The black bishop came to b7. White's bishop went to g2. Black bishop went to e7. White knight came to c3. Black castled. White castled. And now the normal move in this position is knight from f6 to e4. Black knight from f6 to e4, emphasizing his control of the e4 square. But oddly enough, Nimzovich didn't play this. He reverted to a more classical formation. Having religiously avoided occupying the centre with his pawns, he now, on move 7, rather bluntly, played black pawn from d7 to d5. White's reply was very aggressive, knight from f3 to e5, pinning the black d-pawn to the bishop on b7, and Nimzovich reinforced his d5 pawn. He played pawn from c7 to c6, pawn from c7 to c6. Now White has a good opportunity. On move 9 he should play his e-pawn from e2 to e4. The best move is white pawn from e2 to e4. Just play that move on your board for a minute. You'll see then that White has 3 pawns abreast, pawns on e4, d4 and c4. And that's actually what Black was trying to avoid with this subtle opening. Black was trying to control the centre with his pieces, to stop White from getting this sort of pawn centre. But Black's decision to play d5 and c6 lets White play exactly what he wanted to do himself. So I can't really applaud Nimzovich's opening play. It's only in the middle game that he really starts to come into his own. Anyway, please put White's e-pawn back on e2. Remove the white e-pawn from e4 and put it on e2. Instead of this, Zaimish played something much more passive, that gave Black no problems at all. On move 9, he played pawn on c4, takes black pawn on d5. Nimzovich recaptured with his pawn on c6, pawn on c6 takes pawn on d5. Zaimish developed his queen's bishop, bishop from c1 to f4, and Nimzovich played his pawn from a7 to a6. That's really rather a subtle move. His idea is to support an advance of his queen's knight's pawn, pawn on b6 to b5, and then you can see that Black is pressing towards the c4 square. He can develop a knight on d7 or c6, and then play it either to b6 or a5, and it's threatening to come into c4. Of course, White could cover the square c4 by playing b3, but then he weakens the position of his knight on c3. Black could play something like rook c8, attacking the knight, and if White defends it with rook c1, then a bishop could come into a3, embarrassing the rook. So you see, Black already has some kind of ambition on the c-file, and Zaimish's passive play from now on doesn't do much to stop it. White's 11th move was rook from a1 to c1, rook from a1 to c1, and Black played pawn on b6 to b5. The white queen came from d1 to b3, and Black played knight from from b8 to c6. White took the knight, knight takes knight, bishop takes knight. Now, think about this position for a while. Switch off if you want to, and see if you can find the best move for White. I should point out that White is slowly suffering from a kind of creeping cramp. The black pawns on the queen side are threatening to advance, driving back White's knight on c3. Also, the queen on b3 is a little stupidly placed. So see if you can find a move for White that alleviates this cramp. What did you see? The best move for White is knight from c3 to e4. You see, now White's also threatening to bring a knight to c5, which is his equivalent of the c4 square for Black. The move looks a bit idiotic because it puts a knight on prise, but also you see it uncovers an attack from the rook on c1 against Black's bishop on c6. So black would have to take the knight on e4, and white would take the bishop on c6. And the exchange of pieces would considerably alleviate the lack of space from which white is suffering. You see, whenever you have a cramped position, you should try to exchange pieces. However, Zaimish didn't do that. Please replace the white knight from e4 to c3. Zaimish now started to play with sublime disregard of Nimzovich's plans. His 14th move was white pawn from h2 to h3. That's really got very little to do with the position, but Nimzovich's refutation of this passive play is truly wonderful. Black queen came to d7, white king went to h2, and now Nimzovich started a kingside offensive. Black knight from f6 to h5. Of course, white can't allow the exchange of his bishop, so the bishop scurried off to d2, white bishop to d2. The advance continued. Black pawn from f7 to f5. And this active gesture persuaded Zaimish to start a full-scale retreat. The white queen vanished from b3 to d1. It's as if the queen hadn't moved at all. White simply lost 2 moves. Now Nimzovich gained some more space. Black pawn to b4, attacking the white knight. And the knight had to crawl back as well. White knight to b1. There's no other square for it. You see, slowly white's being pushed back. It's as if he'd never developed his pieces in the first place. Now came bishop from c6 to b5. That pins white's e-pawn. So, white unpinned, he played his rook from f1 to g1. Rook from f1 to g1. And now Nimzovich improved the position of his king's bishop. The bishop came from e7 to d6. One threat now is to push on black's f-pawn, with terrible threats against white's pawn on g3. But another point behind bishop to d6 is to set a cunning trap. It looks as if white can free himself at a stroke by advancing his pawn from e2 to e4, and this is in fact what Zaimish did. His 20th move was white pawn from e2 to e4. At first sight you might say, well, that's silly, it just loses a pawn, but the white queen on d1 is now attacking black's knight on h5. And if the knight retreats to f6, then e5 wins a piece. And if black plays g6 to defend his knight, then e5 once again. That would cut out the action of black's bishop on d6. Or he could even take on d5, winning a pawn. After white's 20th move, e2 to e4, switch off for a while and see if you can work out what Nimzovich actually played. Nimzovich's reply to e4 was to sacrifice a piece. Black pawn on f5 takes white pawn on e4. Of course, white hasn't got any choice, he has to take the knight. White queen takes knight on h5. And now Nimzovich made a decisive inroad into the white position. Black rook on f8 takes white pawn on f2. You'll see that white is slowly running out of moves. His queen's already a bit short of squares. The king's bishop's pinned. The knight on b1 doesn't have much to do. And the bishop on d2 hasn't got very many squares to go to. If it moves now, then white's queenside pawns quickly fall prey to black's rook on the 7th rank. Zaimish decided to defend his bishop on d2. He played his queen from h5 to g5, and at the same time he creates an avenue of retreat for his queen from e3 to e1 if necessary. Nimzovich quietly doubled rooks, rook on a8 to f8, and Zaimish unpinned his king's bishop. Very plausible move. King from h2 to h1. Now Nimzovich started to spin his net more tightly. Rook on f8 to f5. The queen has to go back to e3. White queen retired to e3. And now Nimzovich drew the noose even tighter. Bishop from b5 to d3. That cuts off one avenue of escape from the white queen, and the threat is rook e2, netting the queen. So Zamish stopped that. Rook on c1 to e1. That's parried all the direct threats for the moment. But now came a truly remarkable move. Nimzovich quietly played his pawn from h7 to h6. Stare at that position for a while. Switch off the tape if you want to. See if you can find a white move. There aren't any. As can readily be seen, white has no moves left at all that do not lead to disaster. It's a remarkable finish. Nimzovich was extremely proud of this game, and he called it the immortal Zugzwang game. Zugzwang means that you have to move, that any move you make leads to loss. Normally it's a motif that only occurs in the endgame, and it's absolutely incredible that he should get such a position in a middle game with virtually a full board. For example, if white plays the harmless king from h1 to h2 in the final position, black just plays his rook from f5 to f3. The bishop's pinned and white's queen goes. Put the king back on h1 and the rook back on f5. If white moves his rook from c1 to e1, if white moves his rook from e1 to c1, sorry about that, then black simply plays rook e2, and the queen goes again. Put the rook back on f2, and white's rook back on e1. Finally, if white plays his pawn from g3 to g4, there comes rook from f5 to f3. The queen's got no moves, white has to take the rook, bishop takes rook, and then rook h2 is mate. The only possible moves white can play are perhaps to insert a3 or b3, but these are purely temporary measures, and eventually he'll run out of moves with his queenside pawns, so the decision to resign is quite justifiable. That's an absolutely fantastic game, and it's almost unbelievable that it was actually played in a tournament, though of course it was. For our final game, we turn to the encounter Spielmann, white, Nimzovich, black, played at Stockholm in 1920, with Nimzovich's own defence to the king's pawn. Please set up your pieces in the starting position, and we'll go through the opening moves fairly quickly. Spielmann white. First move, white pawn to e4, and Nimzovich played black knight to c6. This is Nimzovich's own patent defence to 1 white pawn to e4. It has some points in common with Alekin's defence, which is 1 white pawn to e4, black knight to f6, but it poses a less immediate challenge to white's centre. White's second move was white pawn to d4. Nimzovich played his pawn to d5. White's third move, white pawn to e5. Black bishop developed at f5, bishop c8 to f5. White played knight to e2, white knight to e2. This is the start of a rather artificial plan. It might have been better to develop the knight at f3 rather than e2, but Spielmann wants to chase black's bishop. Black's fourth move, pawn to e6. White knight came to g3. Black bishop retreated to g6. White pawn came to h4. The threat is white pawn to h5, and black has to stop this advance, either by playing his pawn to h6 or to h5. Nimzovich preferred the latter. Black pawn to h5. The white bishop came to e2, threatening black's h-pawn. Now black could have started a promising attack on the queen side by playing his knight from c6 to b4. Knight c6 to b4. White has to defend his c2 square by playing knight on b1 to a3. And then black can play pawn on c7 to c5. This would make up easily for the loss of the king's rook's pawn. Anyway, Nimzovich didn't play that. Please put black's pawn back on c7, his knight back on c6, and replace the white knight at b1. Nimzovich decided instead to counterattack against white's h-pawn. Black bishop came to e7. Black bishop to e7. White bishop took on h5. Black bishop recaptured on h5. White knight took on h5. Black pawn came to g6. White knight came to f4. Black rook took on h4. White rook took on h4. And black bishop took on h4. And white played queen from d1 to d3. Queen from d1 to d3. Now this is a trap. If black plays his bishop from h4 to g5, bishop from h4 to g5, white wins. Now switch off the tape for a while and see if you can see how white wins after bishop to g5. Did you see it? It's not very hard. White simply plays in reply to bishop g5, knight on f4 takes black pawn on e6. Black has to recapture on e6, and then queen takes pawn on g6 check wins. He's forking the king and the bishop. Please replace the white queen on d3 when you've gone through this variation. Put the black bishop back on h4. Put black pawns back on f7 and g6. And a white knight on f4. Now, try and work out black's next move. You can see that he could quite easily play his queen to d7, then maybe retreat his bishop to e7 and castle queenside. But Nimzovich found a really cunning idea in this position. Switch off the tape now and see if you can find out what it was. It's based on the weakness of white's central pawns, though that's rather a cryptic thing to say. You'll see what I mean in a minute. Nimzovich's 12th move was knight on g8 to e7, which seems to leave his bishop in the lurch. Spielman, quite naturally, probably without thinking very long, played pawn on g2 to g3. Pawn on g2 to g3. Now, if the black bishop retires to g5, white wins as in the previous. Note, he just plays his knight on f4 to e6, taking black's pawn. Black has to recapture, and then he picks off the black bishop on g5 with his bishop on c1. Obviously that's no use. I suggest that once again you switch off the tape and see if you can find black's brilliant reply to white's 13th move, pawn to g3. You may have seen it already before when you switched off the tape, but the idea is so refined and so difficult that it wouldn't do much harm to switch off again before you commit yourself. Black's 13th move was knight on e7 to f5. It's not so remarkable when you look at it now, but Nimzovich had to see this 2 moves ago, and assess all the consequences properly. Of course, Spielman took the bishop. Pawn takes bishop. And now came knight on f5 takes white queen pawn on d4. This creates 2 curious threats. One of them is to play the black knight from c6 to b4, and if white captures the knight on d4, the knight takes c2 check as a family fork. Please put black's knight back on c6. There should be black knights on c6 and d4. Another threat is to play knight on c6 takes e5, and again the queen can't capture the knight on d4 because of knight f3 check. The third threat is for black simply to play queen takes h4. So we see in all events that black not only gains 2 pawns for his piece, he also accelerates his development and completely annihilates the white centre, and that's well worth a piece. Spielman's 15th move was to develop his knight to a3, which does at least get a piece off the back rank and defends the soft spot at c2. Now Nimzovich picked off the h-pawn. He played queen on d8, takes white pawn on h4. He could have taken the e-pawn instead, For example, put the black queen back on d8 and the white pawn on h4. Black knight takes e-pawn, white queen to h3, black knight on e5 to f3 check, white king to f1, black queen takes white pawn on h4. I think black will probably win this position. He's got three pawns for a piece in an endgame, and that ought to be enough to turn the scales in his favour. But Nimzovich had seen something far more brilliant than this, and I think he wanted to see it in action over the board. Please replace some pieces. Put the white king back on e1, put black's knight from f3 back to c6, put white's queen back on d3, put the black queen back on d8, and replace white pawns on h4 and e5. That's the position. It was black's move, and he took on h4 with his queen. White's next move was queen from d3 to h3. Now black could simply have exchanged on h3 and taken the e-pawn on e5 again with his knight, getting the same sort of ending as I mentioned before. What he actually played was to retreat his queen from h4 to g5. Now this lets white check on h8 with his queen, winning black's queen's rook. Please turn off now and see if you can work out what happens if white plays his queen to h8 check. It's very, very complicated, and you may need a lot of time to work it out. When I was annotating this game for my book, it took me a whole day of analysis, and at the end of the day I felt I'd solved the position. So don't be discouraged if you don't find everything. Well, I hope you've enjoyed yourself analysing this position. What Spielman actually played on move 17 was to develop his queen's bishop from c1 to e3. That's a very feeble move, and after that he lost quite quickly, and rather prosaically. So we'll forget the actual course of the game, and just look at queen h8 check. This is the most fascinating part of the analysis. White queen goes to h8 check. Black king comes to d7. White queen takes black rook. Black queen goes to g1 check. White king goes to d2. Black queen takes f2 check. White king goes to c3. Now, whether you did or didn't get this far in your analysis, I suggest you switch off again and see if you can find Nimzovich's next fantastic move. It's an almost unbelievable move, and it's rather hard to explain why he played it until you start to analyse the position, and then you begin to see its hidden beauties. Well, what did you find? Nimzovich's 20th move, planned, although unfortunately he couldn't play it in the game, was 20 knight on d4 to b3, 10 exclamation marks. One point of this is to clear some key squares for black's queen, another one is to block escape routes for white's king. It's a truly fantastic move, I'm sure you must admit that. Anyway, there are many variations after this move. We can't go through all of them, but I'll give you the main line, and you can enjoy yourself by working out the rest. Here goes. Here's white's best defence. King takes knight. Black queen to b6 check. White knight to b5. Black queen takes knight check. White king to c3. Black queen to c4 check. White king to d2. Black queen takes white knight check. White king to e1. Black queen to e4 check. White king to f2. And now a beautiful quiet move, whole rook down, black knight to d4. White's best chance is to clear his back rank. White bishop to h6. But it doesn't do any good. Black queen to f3 check. White king to g1. Black knight to e2 check. White king to h2. Black queen to f2 check. And checkmate next move. With this fantastic example of Nimzovich's brilliant, profound, and mysterious imagination, we must take our leave. I hope that if you quarry into Nimzovich's other games, you'll find just as much to delight and fascinate you.